The color of the berry matters, and we're starting to see this in the scientific literature. What's kind of funny is we used to always tell people with the vegetables, hey, the darker the green, the better it is, the more nutrients are in it. Now, I don't know if that's particularly the case because that involves chlorophyll and it doesn't necessarily constitute more nutrients. But with berries, it seems as though the darker the berry, the more the benefit you get, not just metabolically, but even more pronounced in the brain. Now, when we're talking dark berries, we're talking usually about one particular flavonoid. It's called an anthocyanin. Now, this video is going to get pretty interesting as we talk about how much you need to take in and how it affects the brain. So let's go ahead and dive in. After today's video, you can save 15% off Verso's Clean Being. This is really cool stuff. Okay, so it's utilizing spermidine, it's also utilizing luteolin and dihydroquercetin. These are fascinating compounds when we're talking about sort of the cell recycling. I talk about autophagy a lot on this channel, and Verso's really been big on sort of the cellular sort of health and regeneration anyway, looking at things like NMN and that whole category. But Clean Being is interesting because quercetin is something I talk about all the time as being very powerful for mitochondrial health, eating fruits and vegetables that are rich in quercetin like capers, but dihydroquercetin is easier to absorb, so you arguably get a better concentration of it. Luteolin is interesting because it can switch back and forth to being an antioxidant or a pro-oxidant depending on what is needed in the body. Sometimes you need more oxidative stress, sometimes you need less, and sometimes you need more antioxidant capabilities. So luteolin is almost a smart antioxidant in a way. So very, very interesting stuff. And then spermidine is really powerful sort of for DNA health and proper remodeling and gene expression there. So this combination really can potentially help autophagy. So if you're fasting and you're doing things to induce autophagy, this can help sort of the cleanup. That's why it's called Clean Being. It really does potentially help with that cellular cleanup. So that link down below will save you 15% off, and make sure you use that code Thomas, and that will save you that 15% off. So check them out after this video. Okay, so when we're talking dark berries, it's pretty obvious. We're talking things that have like that bluish, blackish tint to it. So obviously blueberries, we're talking about blackberries, we're talking about boysenberries. Interestingly enough, fun fact on boysenberries, there are more fiber in boysenberries than there is sugar. So a very good berry for low carb. Then we have mulberries, which happen to be like 90% water, so the carb content is not too bad. The glycemic load is very low. So when you're looking at these kinds of berries, some of them are easier to get, but the mulberries and the boysenberries obviously are a little more obscure. They happen to be the best ones you can eat, so you gotta dig for them. Let's get right into the research though. There was a study that was published in the Journal of Human Nutrition and Dietetics. It took a look at 7 studies, okay, so it was a meta-analysis, and it found that 6 out of 7 studies ended up demonstrating a positive correlation between dark berries and anthocyanins and memory. Okay, so the more dark berries, the more anthocyanins in the diet, the better the memory. Now, the caveat with this is this was with older people that were mildly cognitively impaired. So if you look at just this data, you think, okay, well, this is great if my cognitive health is deteriorating, but what if I'm healthy and I want sort of a, I don't know, neurological sort of mental boost? And I will tell you, anecdotally, my own experience, I used to not have any carbohydrates before filming because I needed to be super like astute and just be ready to rock. But learning what I've learned about anthocyanins, I now have about 3/4 of a cup of blueberries before I film, and maybe it's placebo effect, but I notice a huge, almost like nootropic benefit. Anyway, let's look at the research. So this study took a look at subjects that consumed 0 milligrams of any polyphenol or anything. Then another group had 525 milligrams of polyphenols per 60 kilograms of body weight. And then another group just had a flat amount of 142 milliliters of concentrated black currant extract, which would have a lot of anthocyanins in it. But it was just sort of a flat amount no matter what the weight. They found the group that had the extract, the currant extract, ended up having an improvement in their rapid info processing scale, so their visual processing task. So essentially this was a test that helps them determine just how quickly their brain could react. Now, in addition to that, the black currant group also saw a vast improvement in reaction time. So something is going on with the brain, and this is where we start getting into more mechanistic stuff. What's potentially happening? Well, there was one particular in vitro study, so essentially looking in a cultured dish, and they found that anthocyanins had a protective effect that protected neuronal cells from the damaging effects of what are called amyloid plaques. Now, amyloid plaque has come under the microscope a lot recently because we're unsure if it's a cause of Alzheimer's or if it's a side effect or whatever, but the bottom line is that it's doing something that isn't good, whether it's trying to protect a dying brain that's diseased or whatever. It's still, the presence of it isn't good, and it seems to have negative effects. So anthocyanins seem to protect the cells, which is interesting. But let's get a little bit more mechanistic and understand what is boosting the brain. What is actually doing this? Okay, we have to talk about something called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Now, I hate even talking about this because it's been so exploited and over-marketed that it's frustrating to talk about because it's always just totally just adulterated and ruined. But BDNF is very interesting, and anthocyanins do drastically increase BDNF, which improves what is called synaptic transmission, so the ability for like signals to be transmitted throughout the brain, but also increases what's called plasticity. So if you were to go learn a new task right now, it would be hard to really have your brain become plastic to that new task. But increasing plasticity means that the brain learns faster and sort of changes its structure for those new tasks quicker. Now, downstream of that, we get nuancy. There's increase in what's called ARG 3.1. Okay, now this helps with what's called long-term potentiation. Just like the name implies, this is more long-term solidification of the brain changing. So actually, what you are doing is sticking. So like when you're having dark berries, you're having these anthocyanins, you're helping the brain get long-term benefit. Now, there's also benefits in what are called increases in cytoskeleton proteins, particularly in the hippocampal region, which is the main memory region. This is basically like, think of it as cellular scaffolding. Without the scaffolding, the cells would just kind of collapse on top of each other. There wouldn't be the structure, the protein structure. So very, very important for that. And then lastly, there's a massive increase in nitric oxide, okay, which is going to increase blood flow and increase oxygenation to the brain, which has a short-term benefit. So very powerful stuff there. But now when we put a lot of that to bed and we say, okay, this is awesome for the brain. We see this data, we see this literature, but how can it help me metabolically? Why are dark berries potentially better? So berries are good, obviously. They're rich in fiber. They have tannins in them that can slow down carbohydrate digestion and make lower blood sugar spikes. But the anthocyanins themselves do something very fascinating. There is a study published in the European Journal of Clinical Nutrition, took a look at 8 total studies. 3 studies looked at anthocyanins specifically with about 200,000 people, okay? And 5 of the studies took a look at berries in general with about 194,000 people. So lots of people, large cohort study, okay? What they found with this was that subjects that had higher amounts of anthocyanins ended up having about a 15% less chance of developing type 2 diabetes. Now, in addition to this, subjects that ate more berries in general had about an 18% less chance of developing type 2 diabetes. So berries in general are phenomenal. Berries that were rich in anthocyanins that were darker had this additional benefit that was even more powerful. So it goes beyond just the fiber. It goes beyond just the low carbohydrate content. So what's going on here? Well, it's suspected that the anthocyanins, this polyphenol, this flavonoid, actually itself inhibits what is called alpha-glucosidase and maltase. So it slows down the carbohydrate digestion, which in and of itself is great. So it's going to make a big spike more like a gentle bell curve of your blood glucose. But additionally, there have been studies in rodents that have shown that when anthocyanin levels are elevated, you end up having an increase in what's called GLUT4 membrane localization. That means that the GLUT4 is going to the right spot, going to the right part of the cell. Now, what does that mean? That means at the right place, the right time, the big net that reaches into the bloodstream to grab glucose is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. By increasing localization, you're increasing its target and where it's supposed to go. If that GLUT4 doesn't get to the outside of a cell, it doesn't grab glucose. This is exactly what we want. We don't always want a slow carb digestion if we want to absorb them fast, but we do want the cells to utilize it. Now, if we go back to the study that I was talking about before, we find that there is about a 5% reduction in type 2 diabetes risk for every 7.5 milligrams of anthocyanins per day, okay? 5% reduction for every 7.5 milligrams per day. Okay, and there was about a 5% reduction in type 2 diabetes for every 17 grams of berries consumed per day. So do the math with this, right? Where is your perfect number to eat enough berries to get a benefit without eating too many carbs, right? You have to find that sweet spot. So what I've found is if you kind of get yourself in the ballpark of about 1 to 200 grams of good dark berries per day, which is not that hard to do, you're getting yourself this quite dramatic benefit as far as blood glucose modulation, brain effects, but you're also getting the specific anthocyanins, because if you get about 100 to 200 grams of berries per day, you're going to, and they're dark berries, you're probably going to be upwards of 30 milligrams of good quality anthocyanins in a bioavailable form. And it is different than just taking an anthocyanin supplement, because there's this biofeedback and bioindividualization, but also just the natural assembly of sort of nutrients and minerals that are in a fruit and vegetable or in a food in general that works synergistically. Okay, so that synergistic relationship is very important, especially with flavonoids, because some cancel things out and you need that balance. Okay, and lastly, I want to end on the inflammation side, because I think this is so critical. I think that anthocyanin or anthocyanin-rich and dark berries are probably some of the most anti-inflammatory berries that are out there. There was a study that was published in Functional Foods that took a look at 15 lean individuals, 10 obese individuals, and 10 overweight individuals. And it found that when they consumed just their normal diet, but had the extract with 320 milligrams of anthocyanins per day for 28 days, there were dramatic reductions in MCP1, which is a chemokine, as well as reductions in interleukin-6, which is a cytokine. And these decreased mainly in the overweight and obese people. So it's mediating the inflammatory response that comes with being overweight. When you're overweight, you have a lot of inflammation from the adipose tissue itself. You're potentially mediating that, reducing that negative signaling by having these anthocyanins that are coming from dark berries. It's very, very powerful. So if you're worried about carbs, the best route that you can go is going to be with boysenberries and blueberries. Don't get the canned boysenberries, because they are usually more concentrated and they're usually sweeter. Now, a fun fact just to kind of throw out there, we have to remember that fruit has started to become a little more genetically engineered, not saying that's a good or bad thing, to taste better. Okay? Now, what comes with this is more sugar. Okay? They genetically engineer them so they have higher concentrations of fructose and glucose. That does change things a little bit. So my recommendation with blueberries, get frozen wild blueberries. That way you can get the wild ones that are lower in sugar, get them frozen. If they're frozen, they're flash frozen right when you get them, and it ends up saving you A, a ton of money, and B, a ton of headache when you end up having a nice, cute little furry blueberry that's in your fridge because he got all moldy. Okay? So as always, keep it locked in here on my channel. I'll see you tomorrow.